Hello, thanks for joining me today. I'm Pat Speth, author of the Nickel Quilt books. And I love scrappy quilts, and I love to use the 5-inch squares in many of the quilts that I make. So if you happen to have a pile of 5-inch squares looking for a project, I've got a project for you today. And that is the Sawtooth star block that's in the quilt behind me on the wall. This is my steamer trunk treasure quilt. Let's go ahead and take a closer look at it. This is my steamer trunk treasure quilt, and complete instructions for making this quilt in 3 different sizes are included in the pattern. The size shown here is the lap size. Ordering information will be at the end of this video. The 3 sizes are lap, twin, and queen. As you can see, I used 1800s reproduction fabrics to make my quilt, but this quilt would look great in so many fabric styles or so many fabric combinations. So coming up next is materials information needed to make each of the blocks. From the dark fabric, 1 4.5-inch square and 8 2.5-inch squares. From the light fabric, 4 rectangles measuring 2 1/2 inches by 4.5 inches and 4 2.5-inch squares. Our first step, once we have our fabrics cut, is to take one of the 2.5-inch by 4.5-inch rectangles and our 2.5-inch squares. On the back side of our 2.5-inch squares, go ahead and draw diagonal lines from point to point. We are going to place these right sides together on top of our rectangles, making sure that we align those 3 edges. The next thing that we're going to do is we are going to stitch alongside this diagonal line. We get to start our stitching at this nice flat edge and work our way down to the point, stitching alongside that diagonal line and not right on it. Why don't I stitch right on that diagonal line that I drew so carefully from point to point? Well, it's because I want to compensate for the thickness of the thread and the seam allowance and the pressing of the fabric over that seam, so that when I fold back my corners, my outside edges are going to align really nice. If you've worked with the connecting corner method in the past, and if you haven't had success with it, and you were possibly stitching directly on that line, which many patterns out there tell you to do, that could be the reason that you weren't successful in your attempts for working with the connecting corner method. So give this a try, the stitching to the outside of that line. Now I'm going to go ahead and insert a photo here with a close-up so you can see exactly what I'm talking about. On this sample unit I've made, you're able to see my drawn line, my stitching line, and now even a closer look. That stitching line lays right next to my drawn line, and it's always towards the outside edge, the corner, that you're going to be cutting away. Once I've done my stitching to the outside of that diagonal line, I go ahead and I finger press the connecting square back, the triangle back, to make sure that these edges align really nice. And don't forget to check each side of that, the front side and the back side, for alignment. What I do next when I am working with connecting corners is I like to sew a second line of stitching about a 1/2 inch away. It doesn't need to be quite a full inch away, but about a 1/2 inch away, to create my waist triangle units. In my world, my waist triangle units have a lot better chance of turning into a quilt someday if they are already stitched together before I cut them away. And this is what these little guys look like. Here is a sample unit showing that second stitching line. And I usually sew it somewhere between 3/8 of an inch and 1/2 an inch over from that first seam towards the waist triangle that we're cutting away. And I just eyeball this when I'm sending it through my machine, because later when I'm actually going to be using those waist triangle units, I take the time to square those up to the size I'm going to use. And I'm able to square mine up to 1 3/4 inches. Once I have stitched my second line for my waist triangles, I can go ahead and cut my waist triangles away. But a rule I do have for myself is that I never cut away my waist triangles until I have at least finger pressed that connecting square out to make sure my edges have aligned. When I have cut away my waist triangles, I can go ahead and press my seams. And the past several years I've been pressing my seams open. I really like the reduction in the bulk that I get when I press these guys open. You, of course, can press yours any direction you want. You can press them open or up to the sky portion of the unit towards the triangle. After you've added your first connecting corner and you've done your pressing, then for our flying geese unit, we simply repeat that process on the other side. Another 2.5 inch square that we've drawn that diagonal line on, right sides together. Line up those 3 edges and repeat all the stitching that we did on the first side. When we've completed all of our stitching and pressing on our flying geese unit, this is what we are after. We are after a unit that measures 2.5 inches in this direction, 4.5 inches in this direction. Nice sharp points down in the 2 corners, and we've left a 1/4 inch seam allowance here. When we have completed 4 of these flying geese units, we are ready to assemble our Sawtooth star block. I've laid out all the components for the block, and I'm going to sew this together like I would a 9 patch in 3 separate rows. I've sewn the units into 3 rows and pressed. And what I would like to point out also, that when I'm sending these units through, anytime I'm sewing a flying geese unit onto another piece, I like to have the flying geese unit on top so that when I'm stitching my 1/4 inch seam, I'm able to land that point, which will give me then really nice sharp crisp points on my flying geese units. For the pressing on this, let me flip these over. I'm able to press away from the flying geese units in each of the rows. So the top and bottom rows are pressed the same, away from the flying geese unit towards the lighter squares. The center row is pressed in towards the middle square, away from the flying geese unit. So now when I will be joining these units, these rows, into the block, my seams are going to be going opposite, which is always a good thing. I have finished sewing the block together by sewing the 3 rows together, and I've pressed. I went ahead and pressed in towards the center, away from the flying geese units there. And what we are after on this block is the block should measure 8.5 inches square unfinished. It's going to finish at 8 inches, and we want to make sure we have nice 1/4 inch seam allowances out here on those star points. So another great looking block today, the Sawtooth star, and that's all there is to making this block. And until I post my next video, which will be creating the cross block that is in this quilt here, the cross block, the alternate block. So until the next video, have fun making your quilts. The pattern for making the steamer trunk treasure quilt in 3 sizes can be ordered from my website, along with the Nickel Quilt books and many other individual patterns. I've included a link to my website below in the video description area. Purchases from my website will help fund the creation and production of more Nickel Quilt videos for all to enjoy and learn from. Thank you.